Hello everyone. Tonight we are stepping back into the desert winds of Judea, where the air itself seemed to crackle with tension, and where one small spark would set aflame an entire revolt against the mightiest empire the world had ever seen. Picture this: sun-scorched stones glowing under the afternoon heat, Roman tax collectors trudging down narrow streets, and local merchants glaring daggers so sharp you could almost hear them slice the air. And yes, before you ask, you would not survive a day in that heat without some ancient version of a sun hat or, if you're unlucky, a jar of olive oil to smear on your head. Spoiler, it did not help much, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Otherwise, feel free to let the Romans tax you twice as hard. And I'd love for you to drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It always fascinates me to see this community stretch across the world, like the empire we're about to talk about. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soft background music, and let's get started tonight. In the middle of the 1st century CE, Judea was living under Roman control, and to put it mildly, the locals were not thrilled about it. Taxes were high, the Roman garrison often heavy-handed, and cultural friction bubbled everywhere. Imagine if someone marched into your neighborhood, changed the rules, demanded tribute, and then insisted their gods were better dressed than yours. It was a recipe for tension, and the pot was just about to boil over. The Romans had a habit of tolerating local customs as long as the tribute flowed in. But Judea was different. Religion there was not just a tradition, it was identity, law, and life itself. And every Roman standard that bore the eagle symbol into a holy street felt like a violation. Some priests tried to keep the peace, reminding the people that compromise might preserve their way of life. Others, however, whispered rebellion, saying the time had come to cast off the yoke. Historians still debate whether this split was inevitable or if one wise governor could have calmed things down. Meanwhile, on the streets of Jerusalem, rumors spread like wildfire. Tax collectors arrived demanding grain and coin, and in the marketplace, merchants muttered insults loud enough for soldiers to hear, but not quite loud enough to be arrested. Families argued over whether to stay quiet or to send their sons into secret militias forming in the countryside. Some even claimed celestial signs in the sky foretold the coming conflict, though it might just have been dust storms and overeager imaginations. Strangely enough, amid all this looming unrest, life still went on. Bakers still baked, potters still shaped clay, and children still played games in alleyways. Think about it, even on the eve of war, someone had to feed the goats. There's always that one farmer who insists, "I don't care what the Romans or the Zealots are doing, my olives need harvesting." Honestly, history is full of such people quietly ignoring the chaos until it knocks on their door. But for many, the sense of injustice was too strong. Rebellious voices grew bolder, and meetings in dark courtyards were no longer about prayer but about swords, stones, and slings. The Romans, of course, noticed. Patrols doubled, curfews tightened, and whispers of spies filled the taverns. This only fanned the flames of resentment. After all, nothing says we trust you like being watched by an armed soldier every time you buy bread. The leadership of Judea was divided. The wealthy elite, often cooperating with Rome, argued that keeping the peace was the wisest path, even if it meant swallowing pride. But to the poor, crushed under taxes and insulted by foreign garrisons, that sounded like cowardice. Anger simmered in their hearts, and fiery preachers began to speak of freedom, invoking stories of the Maccabees who had thrown off foreign oppressors a century earlier. They whispered that God would send a sign, that Rome's arrogance would be its undoing. Still, rebellion is not born in a single day. It begins with the smallest of acts: a stone thrown at a soldier, a tax resisted, a rumor shouted in the synagogue. And by the time the Romans realized how deep the discontent ran, it was already too late. Judea was a powder keg, and sparks were already flying. Remember how I mentioned the poor olive oil sun hat? Well, just as that was a terrible way to survive the desert sun, the Romans were about to learn that their usual strategies for controlling provinces would not protect them from the storm brewing in Judea. And in the distance, behind the hills of Galilee, the sound of revolt was rising, though few yet knew just how much tragedy it would bring. The first sparks of revolt were not grand battles or sweeping declarations. They were, in fact, a series of small, almost petty incidents that snowballed into something unstoppable. One such spark came when Roman officials attempted to seize temple funds in Jerusalem. To the Romans, this was a practical move. They needed money to pay soldiers, repair roads, and line the pockets of governors who never thought their villas were quite luxurious enough. To the people of Judea, however, it was sacrilege of the highest order. Imagine someone trying to use your sacred savings account to build a swimming pool for their cousin in Rome. There would be outrage, and maybe even a few sandals thrown. Crowds formed, tempers flared, and soon Roman soldiers were facing not just angry words but flying stones. The temple courts, usually filled with the smell of incense and murmured prayers, became a battlefield of fists and chaos. Priests tried to calm the crowd, their voices drowned out by shouts of defiance. Some swore they saw omens in the smoke of the offerings, while others claimed the temple itself trembled. Historians still debate whether the first deaths were deliberate killings or the tragic result of panic, but the result was the same. Once blood was spilled in a sacred space, there was no going back. Word of the clashes spread like wildfire. In the hills of Galilee, groups of zealots armed themselves with whatever they could find: slings, daggers, even farming tools sharpened into makeshift weapons. Roman garrisons suddenly found themselves harassed by ambushes, their patrols whittled down by shadows that struck and disappeared. For the average villager, it was a confusing time. One day you might host Roman soldiers in your courtyard, the next day zealots demanding grain for their cause. Either way, someone was going to eat your bread, and it usually wasn't you. Oddly enough, in the midst of this rising tide of anger, there were still moments of almost comical absurdity. In one village, Roman soldiers confiscated a herd of goats, thinking they had seized supplies for rebels. The goats, however, proved far more rebellious than their owners, escaping in the night, scattering across the hills, and leaving both sides hungry. One chronicler claimed it was a sign from heaven that even the livestock refused Roman authority. Personally, I think it was just goats being goats. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, factions began to form. Some leaders wanted to negotiate with Rome, hoping to find a compromise that might preserve their city from destruction. Others insisted that negotiation was betrayal, arguing that God would favor courage over submission. The debates turned heated, often ending with more dagger points than handshakes. And for the common people, watching these arguments must have felt like seeing the city's future torn apart before their eyes. Roman governors, of course, were not the most subtle problem solvers. To them, unrest was like a leaky roof. Patch it quickly, preferably with nails and wood. And so, troops were dispatched, commanders were rotated, and the empire braced itself for another provincial headache. But Judea was not like Gaul or Britannia. It was not simply about land and taxes. It was about faith, honor, and a history of stubborn resilience. The Romans underestimated just how much fire they were about to face. Even small victories for the rebels became symbolic. A patrol routed near Galilee, a tax official chased from a village, or a Roman banner torn down in Jerusalem, all of these lit the flames higher. Songs were sung in secret, celebrating heroes who had thrown stones at soldiers. Children played games pretending to outwit Romans, which, let's be honest, probably made the real Romans more annoyed than the stones did. Imagine being a legionary, sworn to the might of the empire, only to hear 10-year-olds mocking you with rhymes. No amount of armor protects against that humiliation. By the year 66 CE, the revolt was no longer whispers and rumors. It was open defiance. Zealot bands grew larger, temples echoed with calls to resist, and villagers fortified their gates. In one dramatic moment, rebels stormed a Roman garrison, seizing weapons and proclaiming that the long-awaited uprising had begun. For the first time, the Roman eagle standard, the pride of the legions, was dragged through the dirt of Judea, and that sight alone fueled belief that Rome's days in the region were numbered. But, as history has shown time and time again, Rome did not take insults lightly. They were not the sort to shrug, dust off their togas, and walk away. The empire would respond, and it would respond with legions, fire, and fury. Still, in those early days, before the siege engines rolled and the war machines marched, there was hope among the rebels that maybe, just maybe, Judea could stand tall against the greatest power in the world. And for the moment, at least, it felt like David was once again staring down Goliath, sling in hand, ready to strike. Only this time, the slings were many, and the Goliath wore Roman armor. When the embers of rebellion flared into open fire, Jerusalem transformed into a city both electrified and unsettled. Pilgrims arriving for the festivals found themselves caught between priests urging prayer and zealots calling for war. The city's markets buzzed not only with the chatter of haggling merchants, but also with whispered rumors. A Roman cohort ambushed in Galilee, another garrison retreating under cover of night. Ordinary citizens bought lentils and figs while glancing nervously at the gates, wondering whether tomorrow would bring Roman soldiers or freedom fighters. The revolt's first real triumph came with shocking speed. Rebels stormed and overwhelmed the Antonia fortress, a Roman stronghold attached to the Temple Mount. The fortress, once a symbol of Roman authority looming over the sacred heart of Jerusalem, fell to shouts of defiance and ringing steel. When the smoke cleared, the Roman banners lay trampled underfoot. It was a heady victory, the kind of moment where people actually believed that an empire could be undone by daggers and determination. One priest, seeing the eagle standards burning, supposedly muttered that it smelled more like roasted chicken than divine retribution. That quip, I imagine, didn't make it into Rome's official reports. The celebration, however, carried an uneasy undertone. The Zealots were not a single united faction, they were a collection of bands, each with their own leaders, ambitions, and quarrels. Some sought divine restoration, others pure independence, and a few simply wanted the chance to settle old grudges. The victory at the Antonia fortress gave them hope, but it also gave them more weapons, more confidence, and unfortunately, more reasons to argue. Historians still debate whether these internal divisions doomed the revolt from the start. Beyond Jerusalem, the rebellion spread like an unstoppable rumor. In Caesarea, riots erupted between Jewish and Greek residents, fueled by long-standing tensions and Roman mismanagement. Villages across Judea rose up, some tearing down Roman altars, others driving away tax collectors. Galilee, in particular, became a hotbed of resistance. Farmers who had once tended vines now sharpened their plows into crude blades. Shepherds swapped staffs for slings, and hillside caves became makeshift fortresses. If nothing else, the rebels proved resourceful. Of course, Rome was not exactly sitting on its hands. The provincial governor, shaken by the sudden wave of defiance, sent frantic messages for reinforcements. To the empire, Judea had become more than just a troublesome province. It was a test of imperial authority. If one small region could defy Rome, what would stop others from doing the same? To the governors in Syria and Alexandria, the idea of rebellion spreading was enough to keep them awake at night. And yet, in those early victories, there was an undeniable sense of pride among the rebels. One story tells of villagers in Galilee parading a captured Roman helmet through the streets, as if it were a sacred relic. Children took turns wearing it, though it probably slipped down over their ears and noses. Adults cheered, elders nodded solemnly, and for a brief moment, the entire village believed they had struck a blow that would echo across the empire. Realistically, the only thing echoing was the sound of laughter when the helmet got stuck on someone's head. Still, victories, no matter how small, mattered deeply. The fall of the Antonia fortress was not just about capturing stone walls, it was about defying Rome on holy ground. For many, it felt as though God himself had blessed their uprising. Priests spoke of prophecies fulfilled, zealots promised divine deliverance, and poets began composing hymns celebrating the revolt. These songs were sung in courtyards, whispered in workshops, and hummed in the fields. You could say it was the first rebel soundtrack though. Unlike modern hits, none of them cracked the Roman charts. Yet even as the rebels celebrated, there were murmurs of caution. Older men, who had seen Rome's legions in action, warned that the empire would not take this lightly. They had heard tales of what happened to Carthage, to Gaul, to Britannia. They knew that Rome did not simply punish it, obliterate it. Their voices, that were often drowned out by youthful zeal and the intoxicating rush of victory. In the meantime, the Romans regrouped. The empire might have been caught off guard, but once its legions began to march, they moved with terrifying efficiency. Messengers carried orders, supply lines were prepared, and commanders sharpened their strategies as carefully as their swords. The rebels might have had zeal, but Rome had discipline, wealth, and nearly endless manpower. For now, though Jerusalem basked in the glow of defiance, the temple courts rang with speeches calling for unity, even as whispers of rivalry persisted. Markets bustled with renewed energy, merchants slyly charging higher prices to rebels flush with looted coin. The city had never felt so alive, or so precariously perched on the edge of disaster. It was as though Judea had stepped onto a stage, with the eyes of the empire watching. And in those first triumphs, with Roman banners smoldering and zealot voices rising, it seemed for a fleeting moment that the underdog might just rewrite history. The early euphoria of rebellion didn't last long. Across the Mediterranean, news of Judea's defiance reached the ears of Emperor Nero. And if there's one thing an emperor couldn't afford, it was looking weak. He needed someone ruthless, reliable, and experienced. Enter General Vespasian, a man known less for flair and more for efficiency. The Roman equivalent of hiring the guy who always gets the job done, even if he never cracks a smile at parties. With his son Titus by his side, Vespasian was tasked with one mission: crush the uprising, no matter the cost. When Vespasian set out, he didn't come alone. 3 legions, supported by auxiliaries and cavalry, marched toward Judea. Picture the sight: column after column of soldiers, armor glinting in the sun, standards fluttering with golden eagles, and drums pounding a rhythm that made the earth tremble. Villagers along the roads must have felt as though a tidal wave of iron was approaching, unstoppable and merciless. Rome didn't just march, it announced itself with the weight of inevitability. Meanwhile, inside Judea, rebel leaders argued, as if their debates alone might defeat the empire. Some pushed for open battle, others for hit-and-run tactics, and still more argued about religious interpretations. One zealot leader even suggested fasting for divine aid, though I imagine some of his comrades preferred a hearty meal and sharpened spears. The lack of unity was painfully clear, and Rome, always patient, was more than willing to exploit it. Historians still debate whether a single, united front might have changed the outcome, though most shrugged and say, not likely against Rome. Vespasian wasted no time in showing his method. Instead of charging directly at Jerusalem, he began with a systematic campaign through Galilee and the surrounding regions. His strategy was simple: choke off resistance piece by piece. Every fortress, every village that dared to resist, became a grim example. Those who surrendered were spared or enslaved. Those who fought to the last were erased from the map. To the Romans, it wasn't cruelty, just efficiency. To the rebels, it was a nightmare unfolding step by step. One odd tale survives from this march. In one Galilean town, a Roman soldier supposedly slipped on olive oil, spilled in the street, and tumbled into a donkey cart. The locals, who had been cowering in fear, burst into laughter. For a moment, the great terror of Rome seemed oddly human, more clumsy than unstoppable. But the humor didn't last. By sunset, the town was in ashes, its laughter silenced. That detail may not make the history books, but it shows that even in war, absurdity finds a way to sneak in. As Vespasian advanced, his discipline contrasted sharply with the rebels' chaos. Roman siege engineers, with their measuring rods and geometry, calculated angles for catapults, while zealot fighters argued over who should lead the next raid. Roman supply wagons rolled in neat lines, while rebel supplies often vanished into the pockets of ambitious leaders. Even the Roman campfires burned in perfect squares, a stark reminder of the machine-like precision that defined their way of war. Back in Jerusalem, the mood shifted. The initial victories began to feel like distant memories, overshadowed by reports of villages burning and fortresses falling. Refugees streamed into the city, carrying stories of Roman brutality and despair. Children clung to parents, priests urged courage, and zealots promised that divine intervention was only a prayer away. And yet, in the quieter corners of the city, whispers of doubt grew louder. Would Jerusalem hold when Rome finally came? For Vespasian, the revolt was less about Judea itself, and more about the message it sent. The empire was built on the idea that Rome could not be defied. Letting a small province humiliate its legions would invite disaster elsewhere. He intended to make Judea into a cautionary tale story, whispered in other provinces to remind them of the price of rebellion. And, judging by his methodical progress, he was well on his way. At the same time, politics in Rome added another layer of drama. Nero's erratic rule left many wondering how long the emperor would last. Vespasian, ever pragmatic, may have seen Judea as both a military challenge and a political opportunity. Victories here could translate into prestige back home, and prestige in Rome was the closest thing to currency. Of course, none of this comforted the people of Judea, who faced the empire's wrath firsthand. The rebellion had sparked brightly, but Rome had answered with overwhelming force. Like a storm gathering on the horizon, Vespasian's legions darkened the skies over Judea, and those zealots sang of miracles and deliverance. The reality was far harsher. The empire was coming, step by deliberate step, and it would not stop until Judea was ash and silence. The Roman storm, once unleashed, swept through the countryside with devastating force. Villages that had once echoed with laughter and trade now found themselves staring down disciplined legions, their spears gleaming in the sun like rows of unforgiving teeth. For Judea, it was no longer about winning battles, it was about survival. Vespasian's plan was brutally efficient. Break down resistance piece by piece until nothing remained but submission. And he followed through with chilling precision. Fires rose into the sky, smoke curling over hillsides where communities had stood for generations. Some villagers opened their gates and hoped mercy would find them. They were often spared, though their young men were pressed into chains and marched off to serve Rome in ways they hadn't imagined when they first prayed for deliverance. Others chose defiance, clutching their makeshift weapons, only to be crushed beneath the relentless advance. By the time the legions moved on, the roads were littered with the remnants of rebellion. Yet even amid destruction, life had strange little moments. One Roman officer allegedly confiscated a goat from a Galilean family, only for the goat to escape and butt him into a cooking fire. The tale spread like wildfire among locals, giving them a fleeting moment of humor in an otherwise bleak landscape. Historians still debate whether this goat story was true or simply invented as resistance propaganda. But let's be honest, it's far more entertaining to imagine a furious officer with singed eyebrows trying to regain his dignity. Meanwhile, rebel groups fractured further. Zealots accused moderates of cowardice, moderates accused zealots of recklessness, and priests reminded everyone that prayers should probably be part of the strategy. Instead of uniting against Rome, leaders bickered, forming splinter groups with overlapping visions of salvation. Some fortified mountaintops, others raided supply lines, while a few simply tried to keep their communities hidden. The tragedy was that every quarrel played right into Vespasian's hands. The Roman juggernaut kept rolling. Roads were secured, outposts established, and fortresses besieged. The empire's engineers, perhaps the unsung villains of this story, erected siege ramps with alarming speed. Timber, stone, and sweat combined to create monstrous structures that turned cliffs and walls into minor inconveniences. Where zealots saw divine protection, engineers saw geometry problems waiting to be solved. And geometry, unfortunately, didn't favor the rebels. In Jerusalem, the refugee flood grew worse. Families displaced from Galilee arrived with grim tales, children clutching scraps of bread, women describing villages turned to rubble, men shaking their heads in disbelief at the power of Rome's war machine. Each new arrival brought despair, but also a certain stubbornness. If we can just hold Jerusalem, many whispered, perhaps God will intervene. Faith, after all, was often the last weapon left when swords failed. The mood in the Roman camp couldn't have been more different. Soldiers drilled with unrelenting discipline, their banners shining as if mocking the smoke rising from Judea's burned towns. Evenings were filled with measured routines, meals of grain and cheese, repairs to armor, and dice games where coins clinked against wooden boards. One soldier was said to have brought along a pet monkey, which entertained his comrades by stealing food and throwing it at officers. A small rebellion of its own, though one less likely to change history. As fortresses fell, the Romans also collected intelligence. Captured rebels were questioned sometimes brutally, sometimes cunningly, and information trickled in about strongholds, leaders, and supply routes. Vespasian was not merely a hammer-smashing resistance, he was also a strategist, dissecting it. Each campaign was less about brute force and more about wearing down Judea's spirit, and wear down it did. Still, there were moments of defiance. Some rebel leaders staged daring night raids, slipping into Roman camps to set fires and vanish before the legions could respond. These acts were celebrated as proof that Rome wasn't invincible. Yet, compared to the vastness of the empire's machine, such victories were like flickering candles in a storm. Inspiring, yes, but ultimately fleeting. By the time months had passed, the landscape of Judea was unrecognizable. Fortified towns were rubble, fertile fields were trampled under legionary boots, and once bustling marketplaces were eerily silent. Survivors spoke in hushed tones, not daring to dream of victory anymore. Instead, they prayed for endurance. And yet, in the ashes of defeat, whispers of hope still lingered. Fragile, but stubborn, Rome was making its point. The fall of each village, each fortress, was a message carved into the land itself. The empire could not be defied, and as the sun set over the smoking hills, even those who still dreamed of freedom knew the shadow of Rome was closing in, step by merciless step. Despite the devastation sweeping across Judea, there were moments when the rebels seemed to shine, at least briefly, with a kind of desperate brilliance. Early victories, small skirmishes, ambushes, and surprise raids gave the zealots confidence that perhaps, just perhaps, they could hold their own against the most powerful empire in the world. After all, what's a few legions compared to faith, courage, and maybe a couple of well-placed rocks rolled down a hill? Some battles became the stuff of whispered legend. One band of rebels lured Roman patrols into a ravine, collapsing boulders onto them and sending survivors fleeing in panic. The zealots proclaimed it proof that divine favor was on their side. Songs were even composed about the day Rome ran from the stones, though one can imagine the embarrassed legionaries skipping over that detail in their letters home. For the rebels, it was intoxicating, a surge of hope in the midst of despair. But hope has a way of clouding judgment. Instead of using their nimble tactics consistently, zealot leaders grew overconfident. Some began to argue that they should face Rome in open battle, a decision that historians still debate with raised eyebrows. Against Rome's discipline, training, and sheer numbers, charging head-on was like trying to outshout a thunderstorm. You might get noticed, but you weren't going to win. Odd details from this time show the strange contrast between daily life and warfare. In one fortress, zealots apparently insisted on keeping ceremonial trumpets polished, even as their defenses crumbled. A Roman observer allegedly joked that if music could win wars, Judea would have already triumphed. The rebels took it as a point of pride, though perhaps they should have spent more time reinforcing the walls. Still, those small wins mattered. For every victory Rome claimed, the rebels tried to match it with a defiant gesture. Even stealing supplies from a Roman camp was celebrated, as though it had turned the tide of the war. Children in Jerusalem were said to play games imitating zealots, raiding legionaries, turning trauma into play. It was resilience in its rawest form. But the cracks were widening. Different factions within the rebellion clashed, sometimes more bitterly than they fought Rome. Zealots accused moderates of betrayal. Moderates accused zealots of recklessness. And a few opportunists simply looted what they could. Instead of forging unity, victories created rivalries. Each success, however small, was claimed by one faction, fueling jealousy in the others. Rome, watching from a distance, had to be quietly amused. Their enemies were doing half the work for them. Vespasian understood the psychology of war. He allowed these small rebel triumphs to linger, knowing that when the inevitable Roman response arrived, it would feel all the more crushing. He used time as a weapon, letting overconfidence swell until it became a trap. To him, patience wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Meanwhile, Jerusalem wrestled with its own contradictions. In the city's marketplaces, despite the looming threat, merchants still sold bread, olives, and wine. Priests continued rituals in the temple. Life tried to cling to normalcy, as though the walls of Jerusalem could keep reality at bay. But beneath that thin veneer of calm, everyone knew the storm was coming. Refugees spoke of Roman machines that could level walls, of legions that moved like clockwork, and of villages erased without hesitation. One particularly bizarre account tells of a zealot who captured a Roman helmet and wore it proudly, strutting through the streets as if he had single-handedly defeated the empire. Children cheered, and adults smiled grimly. But the next day, the same man tripped over a water jar, denting the helmet, and the story was quickly adjusted. Perhaps it was an omen. Perhaps the gods were sending a message about hubris. Even in rebellion, people couldn't resist a little superstition. The rebels' early victories created a dangerous illusion that Rome could actually be beaten, and in that illusion lay tragedy. Confidence turned to complacency, and complacency invited disaster. The empire was patient, relentless, and very good at reminding the world that resistance was futile. Still, for the people of Judea, those fleeting triumphs mattered. They weren't just battles, they were symbols of defiance, sparks of dignity in a world collapsing around them. And as the fires of rebellion flickered, even faintly, they gave ordinary people something to hold on to, a reminder that even against impossible odds, the human spirit still tried to stand tall. High in the rugged hills of Galilee stood Jotapata, a fortress clinging to the rock like a stubborn weed between cracks in stone. For the rebels, it became a beacon of resistance, a stronghold that symbolized defiance against Rome's crushing advance. And for the Romans, it was simply another obstacle in need of removal, preferably with fire, steel, and a little engineering flair. Vespasian, methodical as ever, decided to make Jotapata an example. Inside its walls, the defenders prepared for the inevitable. Among them was a man whose name would echo down through history, Josephus, a rebel commander and, ironically, a future historian. At this moment, however, he was less concerned with writing scrolls than with keeping his head attached to his shoulders. The defenders patched walls, stockpiled food, and prayed fervently, hoping that the rocky cliffs and their determination would hold against the empire. Spoiler, it wouldn't. The siege began with Roman precision. Legions encircled the fortress, cutting off all supply lines. Camps sprang up in neat grids around the base of the hill, and siege engines rolled into place with a grim inevitability. Catapults hurled stones, battering the walls day and night, while towers crept closer like wooden beasts. From atop the battlements, defenders hurled rocks and flaming pitch, cheering when Roman shields splintered or soldiers fell. Each small success was met with songs of triumph, as though the fortress itself might sing with them. Life inside the besieged city was grim, but strangely routine. Food grew scarce, yet defenders shared whatever they could. One bizarre tale claims that an old woman brewed victory soup from boiled herbs and shoe leather, insisting it gave strength. Historians still debate whether this soup was real or merely a morale tale, though I personally hope nobody actually chewed on sandals that week. Josephus tried to keep morale high, reminding his followers that God had delivered Israel before and could do so again. But faith did little to stop the relentless Roman machines. Day after day, stones slammed into the walls. Dust filled the air, turning the fortress into a choking cloud. At night, the glow of Roman campfires reminded everyone that escape was impossible. To make matters worse, Roman trumpeters liked to blast signals at odd hours, fraying nerves and robbing the defenders of sleep. It was war by exhaustion, and it worked. One small moment of humor, however, slipped through. A Roman soldier climbing a siege ladder supposedly shouted something triumphant, just as a defender dumped a bucket of hot oil on him. The man fell so quickly that his comrades thought he had vanished by sorcery. The defenders laughed until their sides hurt, a rare gift in such dark times. Still, laughter could not mend broken walls. After weeks of relentless pressure, Jotapata's defenses began to crumble. Stones that had stood for centuries cracked under Roman engineering. Breaches widened, and hope narrowed. When the final assault came, it was swift and merciless. Romans poured into the fortress, their shields locked, their discipline unshaken. The defenders fought valiantly, but it was as though they had been swept up in a flood. Amid the chaos, Josephus found himself cornered with a small group of followers. Tradition says they resolved to die rather than fall into Roman hands, forming a grim pact. Each man was to kill another until only one remained. In the end, Josephus, whether by cunning, chance, or fate, survived. Historians still debate whether he manipulated the lot drawing or simply refused to carry out the pact fully. But either way, he surrendered to the Romans and lived. And live he did, going on to write the very histories that inform us today. Talk about switching sides at the last minute. Vespasian spared Josephus, intrigued by his intellect and perhaps sensing his value as a chronicler. For the rebels, however, Jotapata was lost. The fortress that once symbolized hope now stood as a ruin, its defenders slain or enslaved. The Roman message was clear. No wall, no cliff, no mountain could stand against the empire's might. The fall of Jotapata was more than a military victory, it was psychological warfare. Word spread quickly, carried by refugees and rumors, that even the strongest fortress had fallen. Fear seeped into Judea's veins, making resistance seem less like destiny and more like futility. The rebellion still burned, but its flame flickered weaker now, trembling in the shadow of Rome. Jerusalem, the beating heart of Judea, now braced for its greatest test. If Jotapata had been a stone fortress on a hill, Jerusalem was a citadel of faith, a city that carried the hopes of an entire people. Its towering walls glistened in the sunlight, its gates barred against the Roman advance. For the rebels inside, the city was untouchable, a sanctuary sanctified by God himself. For the Romans, however, it was just the final and most important stronghold to crush. Vespasian, though, was no fool. Instead of rushing into Jerusalem's defenses, he adopted a slower, colder strategy: starve them out. The legions spread across the countryside, cutting roads, seizing farmland, and ensuring that no grain, sack, or fig basket made it into the city. Villages burned, olive groves were trampled, and shepherds fled with their flocks into the hills. It wasn't simply an attack on soldiers, it was an attack on daily bread. The lifeline of a population. Inside Jerusalem, tension rose with every passing day. Rebel factions argued about how best to defend the city. Some demanded open battle, charging the Romans in the fields. Others insisted that God would never allow his temple to fall, and so they urged patience and prayer. The debates often turned violent, with rival groups clashing in the streets even as Roman forces tightened their grip outside. It was as if the city fought wars, one against Rome, and one against itself. Food quickly became a weapon of its own. Merchants hoarded grain, selling crumbs at outrageous prices. Desperate families searched for weeds and wild roots among the stones. One bizarre account claims that a wealthy man roasted leather straps and served them as stew, insisting it was delicacy of the temple kitchens. Historians still debate whether this was an actual dish or simply a metaphor for how desperate things became. Either way, chewing on old belts does not sound like a Michelin-star meal. To make matters worse, the rebels, mistrustful of one another, sometimes burned food supplies so that rival factions could not control them. Imagine that, starving in the middle of a siege because your neighbor set fire to the granary just to spite you. At times, Jerusalem seemed less like a holy city and more like a powder keg waiting to blow. Meanwhile, Roman camps flourished with discipline. Soldiers dug ditches, built ramparts, and feasted on supplies brought in from across the empire. From the walls, the people of Jerusalem could see the order and abundance of the enemy and compare it bitterly with their own hunger. Every night, the glow of Roman torches ringed the city like a necklace of fire, a reminder that escape was impossible. Yet hope persisted in strange ways. Priests offered sacrifices in the temple, praying for divine intervention. Mothers whispered stories of past deliverance, of Pharaoh's defeat and Babylon's downfall, convincing children that God would surely act again. Some even pointed to omens in the stars, claiming that celestial signs promised Rome's destruction. Historians still debate whether these omens were real, or whether hungry eyes simply saw what they wanted in the night sky. Occasionally, small bands of rebels attempted daring sorties, sneaking out under cover of darkness to raid Roman camps. One night, they managed to snatch a few barrels of wine and return triumphantly, only to drink most of it themselves before distributing it. The next day, hungover defenders struggled to stay awake on the walls, much to the amusement of Roman archers who lobbed arrows at their sluggish movements. Even in tragedy, humanity found a way to laugh or at least stumble. As weeks turned into months, the atmosphere in Jerusalem grew heavier. Songs in the marketplace were replaced by whispers of betrayal. Every sound seemed ominous: the creak of a gate, the crack of a branch, the murmur of someone praying too loudly. Trust eroded, replaced by paranoia. Some said spies moved among the people, feeding Rome with information. Others accused neighbors of collaborating just to secure bread. The unity that once fueled the revolt now fractured into suspicion. Vespasian, ever patient, waited and watched. The city was slowly devouring itself from the inside, and the Romans didn't have to lift a finger to encourage it. Siege warfare, after all, was not about how fast you could batter a wall, but how long you could make your enemies suffer behind it. By the end of the season, Jerusalem had become a city of shadows, part fortress, part prison. Hunger gnawed, fear deepened, and yet, somehow, the flame of resistance still flickered. Despite everything, many believed that the city's holiness made it untouchable. They were convinced Rome could batter its gates, starve its people, and burn its fields, but it could never truly break Jerusalem's spirit. That belief, however, was about to be tested more brutally than anyone inside those walls could have imagined. By the year 70 CE, the war had entered its most dramatic stage. The mantle of leadership had shifted. Vespasian had returned to Rome to claim the imperial throne, and his son Titus was now entrusted with finishing the Judean campaign. Titus was younger, energetic, and perhaps a little eager to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy. Jerusalem, at this point, was no longer just a city. It was the symbol of defiance that the Roman Empire could not allow to stand. Titus marched with 4 legions, their banners snapping in the wind, and set up camp around the holy city. If Vespasian had tightened the noose, Titus was ready to yank it. Siege engines were hauled into position, towering battering rams, great catapults that could hurl stones the size of oxen, and ballistae designed to fire heavy bolts straight into the walls. From a distance, the Romans looked like master builders constructing a massive wooden city of their own, but their architecture was designed to destroy inside Jerusalem. However, the defenders prepared as best they could. They reinforced weak spots in the walls, manned every tower, and shouted defiance at the Romans below. The city was surrounded by 3 massive walls, each formidable in its own right. The rebels believed that even if Titus breached one, he would never take all 3. For them, survival was not only possible, it was destined. After all, wasn't the Temple of Jerusalem the house of God himself? Surely, they thought, no foreigner could desecrate such a place without consequence. The Romans began their attack on the outermost wall, launching a barrage of stones and fire. The noise was deafening, the crash of rocks against stone, the whine of arrows, the shouted orders of centurions echoing through the valley. Defenders hurled down flaming torches, poured boiling oil, and even rolled heavy beams onto the Roman machines. One chronicle bizarrely mentions that some desperate fighters catapulted beehives down at the enemy. Historians still debate whether this was a fact or an exaggeration, but the image of angry Romans swatting bees in the middle of battle is too entertaining not to imagine. It was a brutal tug-of-war, with the outer wall changing hands more than once. Finally, after relentless pounding, the Romans broke through. They surged into the first ring of the city, only to find that the rebels had fallen back behind the second wall, fighting from alleys and rooftops. Every step forward cost Roman lives, and every courtyard became a miniature battlefield. Titus, however, was not only a warrior but also a strategist. He ordered his men to clear space, demolish houses, and create wide roads to move siege equipment deeper into the city. To him, the city was not sacred, it was simply an obstacle course to dismantle piece by piece. Slowly, the Romans advanced, pressing the defenders closer to the Temple Mount. But something unexpected began to trouble Titus, the ferocity of the Jewish defenders. He had fought in Britain, in Gaul, and in Germania, but never had he encountered resistance so stubborn. The defenders did not break even when surrounded. They fought with a mix of desperation and faith, and sometimes even laughter. One Roman account describes defenders mocking the soldiers by dancing on the walls, while arrows whistled past them. Another claims that they painted insults on the stones before hurling them back with Roman catapults. You could say it was the ancient equivalent of trolling your enemies mid-battle. As weeks turned into months, the cost of the siege mounted. Roman soldiers grew restless, and supplies thinned. Titus considered offering terms of surrender, hoping to preserve the temple and avoid total devastation. Messengers were sent, but the defenders either rejected them outright or killed the envoy. To them, surrender was unthinkable. Inside the city, conditions had become catastrophic. Famine stalked the streets. Once proud homes became hollow shells where families withered in silence. Some foraged for scraps of leather, reeds, or grass. One rumor claimed that gold had been found hidden in the walls, leading desperate diggers to tear down their own houses in search of treasure. Historians still debate if this frenzy was real or symbolic of a society eating itself from within. Either way, it was not exactly a sound financial strategy. Meanwhile, Titus pressed forward. The second wall fell, then parts of the third, though progress was agonizingly slow. Each time the Romans captured ground, the rebels fought savagely to reclaim it. Jerusalem had become a maze of destruction, its once grand avenues reduced to rubble and bloodied stones. At the center of it all stood the temple. Its golden facade gleamed in the sunlight, a beacon that gave defenders courage and reminded Romans of the prize they sought. To Titus, it was both a challenge and a temptation. Destroy it to crush resistance completely, or spare it to prove Roman clemency. He hesitated, perhaps hoping for a resolution that would allow him to march into history as both conqueror and protector. But fate had its own designs. The siege dragged on, testing both armies. Jerusalem was now a city teetering between sanctity and ruin, with the temple looming as the heart of the storm. Titus could wait, but the city itself was running out of time. The summer heat hung heavy over Jerusalem as the siege ground into its final, terrible stages. By now, Titus had breached 2 of the great walls, and his forces pressed ever closer toward the Temple Mount. For the defenders, hope was little more than a memory. but they clung to their sacred city with the stubbornness of a people who would rather die than surrender. The temple itself dominated the skyline, its white stone walls and gilded roof still catching the sunlight even as smoke rose around it. For the Romans, it was both a prize and a problem. Titus reportedly wished to preserve it, hoping that such mercy might earn him glory in Rome and favor among the conquered. Yet the chaos of battle, the ferocity of the defenders, and the sheer exhaustion of the legions made restraint difficult to maintain. The fighting surged through the narrow streets leading to the temple. Every archway became a barricade, every rooftop a fortress. Roman soldiers pushed forward in disciplined ranks, shields raised, while zealots hurled rocks, spears, and firebrands from above. The noise was relentless steel against steel, the cries of the wounded, and the shouts of commanders trying to be heard over the bedlam. One strange detail survives from the chronicles. Some defenders allegedly coated the stones of their walls with pitch and grease, making them too slippery for Roman siege engines to grip. Historians still debate whether this was actually effective or just another story added to dramatize the stubborn defense. But one can imagine Roman engineers cursing under their breath while slipping on tar-covered boulders. As the siege dragged on, famine tightened its grip inside the city. Bread was no longer a luxury, it was a fantasy. Mothers starved, children wailed, and even the defenders themselves grew gaunt and desperate. And yet, incredibly, the fighting did not cease. Faith, pride, and sheer defiance carried the rebels forward, even when their bodies were wasting away. At last, Roman forces stormed the outer courts of the temple. Titus himself reportedly entered, marveling at the splendor within. Its columns gleamed, its altars shone, and even amid war, it exuded a holiness that seemed untouchable. Perhaps, in that moment, he truly did intend to spare it. He ordered his men to extinguish flames that had begun in one corner. But battle is a beast with a will of its own. A soldier, whether by accident, impulse, or rage, hurled a flaming torch through a window. The fire spread with terrifying speed, feeding on the wooden beams and draperies inside. Soon, the temple was engulfed in flames, its gold melting and running like rivers along the stones. Titus, historians say, rushed to stop it, but by then it was too late. The destruction of the Second Temple was not just the fall of a building, it was the collapse of an entire world. The holiest place in Judaism, the center of worship and sacrifice, reduced to ashes before the eyes of its defenders. The rebels fought with renewed desperation, but the fire demoralized many. Some fled, others hurled themselves at the Romans in futile last stands, and still others retreated deeper into the burning city. The Romans, meanwhile, pressed their advantage. They tore down walls, slaughtered resistance, and claimed one district after another. The temple's treasures, gold, silver, sacred vessels, were seized and carried off, destined to parade through Rome in Titus's future triumph. Ironically, some objects would later decorate the Colosseum itself, turning symbols of faith into ornaments of empire. For the Jewish people, the loss was spiritual as well as physical. The temple was more than stone, it was the covenant made visible. To see it burn was to feel as though heaven itself had turned away. Yet, even amid despair, whispers spread that the temple's destruction was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter in their faith. Of course, historians still debate whether Titus truly wanted to save the temple, or if his orders were half-hearted, knowing destruction was inevitable. Maybe he sought the reputation of mercy while letting his soldiers claim the brutal glory of conquest. Either way, the result was the same. The fire burned, and with it, Jerusalem's heart. By the end, the city was unrecognizable. Once great avenues were filled with rubble, palaces lay in ruins, and the temple's golden roof was nothing but molten slag. The Romans had won, but the victory was bitter, even for them. Tens of thousands had perished, both soldiers and civilians, and the empire's treasury had been drained by the relentless campaign. Titus, surveying the wreckage, must have realized that though he had conquered a city, he had also forged a legend. For centuries to come, the fall of the temple would echo in prayers, songs, and laments, and for the Romans, it would become a symbol of the empire's power, etched forever into triumphal arches and marble. Reliefs. Jerusalem had fallen, its jewel reduced to ash, but even in defeat, the story was not yet over. Survivors scattered into exile, carrying their grief and their traditions with them, planting seeds that would shape the Jewish diaspora for millennia. The fire might have consumed the temple, but it could not consume memory. With Jerusalem in ruins and the temple reduced to ash, the war might have seemed finished, but for many, it was only the beginning of an even darker chapter. The Romans had crushed the heart of Judea, but scattered bands of rebels and desperate survivors still clung to strongholds across the countryside. Chief among these was Masada, the fortress that loomed over the desert like a last beacon of defiance. Before Titus could march toward those final strongholds, he had to deal with the aftermath of the city's fall. The streets of Jerusalem were littered with corpses, collapsed houses, and smoldering ruins. Roman engineers moved swiftly, dismantling what remained of the walls to ensure the city could never again rise in revolt. Soldiers carted off treasure, and slave dens of thousands of them were driven in chains toward ports bound for Rome. The sight was grim, but it also served as propaganda. Rome wanted the world to see that resistance was futile. Among the survivors, chaos reigned. Families searched for lost loved ones, often finding only fragments of clothing or burnt remains. Some bribed Roman officers for safe passage, while others slipped into the hills, hoping to evade capture. One odd rumor claimed that a group of survivors hid sacred scrolls inside clay jars and buried them in caves to keep them safe from Roman plunder. Historians still debate whether this account is true, but discoveries like the Dead Sea Scrolls centuries later give the story a haunting plausibility. Titus, meanwhile, prepared for his return to Rome. He had accomplished what no Roman commander before him had achieved: the subjugation of Jerusalem. Yet his departure left unfinished business. Other fortresses, Herodium, Machaerus, and, most famously, Masada, still harbored rebels who refused to bow. Vespasian, now emperor after a turbulent year in Rome, was determined that no ember of resistance should remain. He entrusted the task to Flavius Silva, a stern and relentless general who believed in finishing the job no matter the cost. Masada stood out among the remaining holdouts, not just for its strategic location but also for its symbolism. High atop a desert plateau, it was practically unassailable, with sheer cliffs on all sides and only a narrow snake-like path winding up to its gates. Herod the Great had built it as a palace and fortress decades earlier, never imagining it would one day become a sanctuary for rebels against Rome. For those who now occupied it, a radical faction infamous for their daggers and assassinations, it was both a refuge and a final declaration of defiance. Life inside Masada was austere but bearable. The fortress boasted storerooms filled with grain, cisterns brimming with water, and walls strong enough to repel almost any assault. The Sicarii believed they could outlast the Romans indefinitely, or at least hold long enough to inspire others. Their leader, Eleazar, preached that it was better to die free atop Masada than live as slaves under Rome. His words resonated with the weary survivors, who had already witnessed the horror of Jerusalem's fall. Meanwhile, in Rome, Titus's triumph was carefully staged. Vast crowds gathered to watch him parade through the city, leading long lines of Jewish captives and wagons filled with spoils from the temple. Among the treasures was the great golden menorah, carried high so that all could see Rome's victory over the god of Judea. The procession ended with sacrifices to the gods of Rome, and the construction of monuments that still stand today. It was a performance of power as much as a military celebration. Back in Judea, however, the war was not quite so theatrical. The Sicarii made occasional raids from Masada, harassing Roman patrols and ambushing supply trains. Their strikes were more symbolic than strategic, but they kept the flame of resistance alive. Roman soldiers grumbled at the thought of scaling desert cliffs just to chase a few hundred rebels. Yet for Silva, this was about principle. Rome tolerated no unfinished wars. In one curious twist, Masada also became a place where refugees from other failed uprisings gathered. Families, priests, zealots, and fugitives all crowded within its walls, bound together by despair and determination. Strangely, some accounts mention that the rebels argued over small matters, like how to divide water or who got the best storage chambers, showing that even in the shadow of annihilation, human pettiness endured. Historians still debate whether these quarrels were exaggerated by Roman chroniclers or genuinely reflected the strain of survival and confinement. By the end of the year, Silva had assembled a force large enough to surround Masada. His legions marched into the Judean desert, building camps that ringed the fortress like iron teeth. The Sicarii, looking down from their high walls, knew that the end was coming, and yet, strangely, there was no despair in their eyes, only a grim acceptance that their story would end here, on this rocky plateau above the Dead Sea. The stage was set. The war's final act would not be a grand battle in the streets of Jerusalem, but a haunting drama on a lonely desert cliff. The Romans had conquered a city, but they would soon confront the unbreakable will of a people who refused to surrender even if it meant embracing death itself. The fortress of Masada rose from the desert like an island of stone, its jagged cliffs glinting under the relentless sun. To the Romans camped below, it seemed both daunting and mocking, a reminder that even after years of conquest, one final bastion still defied the empire. For the Sicarii within, however, it was sanctuary, a place where they could make their last stand. High above the reach of ordinary armies, Flavius Suva, the Roman general tasked with subduing the fortress, understood that brute force alone would not be enough. His engineers examined the terrain and quickly dismissed the narrow snake path as suicidal. One man could defend it against 100. Instead, they turned their gaze to the western side of the plateau, where a natural spur of rock jutted toward the cliffs. It was here that Silva decided to build a siege ramp, an audacious plan that would require months of labor under scorching desert skies. The construction began immediately. Thousands of soldiers and slaves hauled stones and earth, dumping them in layers until the slope slowly crept upward toward the walls. Day after day, the ramp grew longer, wider, and taller, an artificial mountain rising to challenge Masada's natural one. The Sicarii, watching from above, must have felt both awe and dread as they saw the Romans literally building a road to their gates. Life inside the fortress continued, though under the shadow of inevitability. The Sicarii rationed grain, drew water from their cisterns, and prayed in whatever way they could. Children played in courtyards that had once belonged to Herod's palace, their laughter oddly out of place against the backdrop of siege warfare. Some even mocked the Romans below, tossing stones and insults from the walls. It was bravado, of course, but in times of despair, defiance itself was a kind of courage. One strange story claims that the defenders hung garments on the walls to make it appear they had abundant supplies and wealth, tricking the Romans into thinking starvation was far away. Whether this was a clever ruse or just folklore, historians still debate, but it paints a vivid image of rebels turning laundry into psychological warfare. The Romans pressed on with unyielding discipline. Their camp sprawled across the desert floor in neat squares, each tent lined up as though drawn by ruler and compass. Soldiers drilled, cooked, and joked, but the ramp remained their central obsession. Day and night, torches lit the work as oxen and men dragged materials uphill. Progress was slow but undeniable. The ramp crept closer to the fortress walls, like a predator stalking its prey. Inside, Eleazar ben Yair, the Sicarii leader, gave speeches to keep spirits high. He reminded his people that they were the last free Jews in Judea, the final spark of resistance against Rome. His words carried the weight of tragedy, yet they also gave his followers a sense of purpose. Better to perish on their own terms, he argued, than to be paraded in chains through the streets of Rome. The fortress itself seemed to conspire with the defenders. Its walls were thick, its gates reinforced, and its towers offered commanding views over the desert. Even with the ramp nearing completion, many Sicarii still believed they could withstand the Romans indefinitely. After all, hadn't Jerusalem's defenders once thought their walls impregnable? History has a way of repeating itself, but people rarely notice until too late. As the months wore on, Silva's ramp neared the summit. Roman war engines, ballistae, and catapults were hauled up, ready to hurl stones and bolts once the breach was made. From below, the camp buzzed with anticipation. From above, the fortress held its breath. One odd detail from Roman records mentions that scorpions plagued the laborers, scuttling from the rocks, disturbed by the ramp's construction. Soldiers devised clever ways to trap them in jars, sometimes wagering who could catch the most before nightfall. It was a small distraction from the monotony of toil, though perhaps not the kind of entertainment most would envy. By now, the Sicarii could see the inevitable. The ramp would reach their walls, and when it did, Rome would come storming through. Yet surrender was unthinkable. They had seen what happened in Jerusalem, had heard the stories of captives dragged in chains or crucified along the roads. For them, the choice was not between life and death. It was between freedom and death, or slavery and life. The stage was set for the final act. The ramp, looming ever higher, stood as both an engineering marvel and a harbinger of doom. Below, the Romans tightened their grip. Above, the Sicarii steeled themselves for the end. Neither side could yet know that what would unfold at Masada would echo across centuries, remembered not merely as a siege, but as a symbol of resistance, tragedy, and the haunting cost of defiance. At last, the Roman ramp touched the edge of Masada's walls, and silence hung over the desert like a heavy cloak. Flavia Silva gave the order, and with a groan of wood and iron, the massive siege tower rolled up the slope. Inside it, a battering ram swung like a pendulum, striking against the fortress wall with dull, rhythmic thuds. Each impact echoed across the plateau, as though time itself were counting down to the end. The Sicarii watched in grim silence. For years they had defied Rome. For months they had mocked the siege ramp. But now, faced with the pounding of the ram, they could no longer deny what was coming. The walls that had protected them, the stones that had given them strength, now trembled under the force of Roman engineering. Dust rained down, cracks appeared, and the fortress shuddered with each blow. Eleazar Ben-Yor gathered his people in the central courtyard. Men, women, and children clustered around him, listening as he delivered what history remembers as his final speech. He spoke of freedom, of dignity, of the cruelty of Rome. He argued that their lives would end either in slavery or death, but only death could be chosen on their own terms. Better, he said, to meet death as free people than to live as captives. His words were solemn, stirring, and, depending on who you asked, tragically persuasive. Historians still debate whether every word attributed to him was real, or whether later writers dramatized the speech, but the effect on the Sicarii was undeniable. The decision was made. They would not surrender. They would not let the Romans march them in chains, nor see their children sold in markets, nor watch their women abused as spoils of war. Instead, they resolved to end their lives together, a defiant act meant to rob Rome of its final victory. But even in this darkest hour, humanity flickered. Fathers held their children, mothers whispered lullabies as though sleep not death awaited. Families clung to one another, perhaps hoping that together, the passage from life would be less terrifying. There are accounts that the Sicarii chose 10 men by lot to carry out the grim deed, each tasked with ending the lives of others until only one remained, who then fell on his own sword. The logistics sound cold, but behind them lies an unbearable tenderness. No parent wanted to leave their child to a stranger's blade, and no child wanted to see their parent fall alone. Outside the walls, the Romans continued their assault, unaware of the decision being carried out within. Soldiers cheered each time the ram struck home, joking about the spoils they would soon enjoy. Little did they know that by the time they breached the gates, there would be no captives, no treasure, no victory, paired only silence. One odd detail survives in later tales. Some claim that food stores inside Masada were deliberately left untouched, even piled up for the Romans to see. The Sicarii wanted it known that they did not die of hunger or thirst, but by choice. Whether true or embroidered by legend, it paints a chillingly defiant image. Full granaries, empty halls, and a people gone forever. As night fell, torches flickered on the walls, but no stones or arrows flew down at the Romans. The silence puzzled them, but they continued their preparations for a final assault at dawn. In the fortress, the last voices faded one by one, until only the wind swept across the plateau. By morning, when the Romans finally breached the gates, they entered a city of the dead. Bodies lay in silence, weapons unused, stores untouched. The soldiers who had expected resistance, who had braced for blood and glory, instead found only tragedy. The conquest they had labored for had been denied them in the cruelest way, through the absolute refusal of their enemies to be conquered at all. The tale of Masada did not end there. 2 women and 5 children, it is said, survived by hiding in a cistern, later recounting what had happened. Their testimony shaped the story that would echo through history, though whether they told all, or only what they dared, remains uncertain. Standing in the fortress, Silva must have felt both victory and emptiness. Rome had won, but there were no captives to drag in triumph, no living to parade. Masada had fallen, yet in its fall, it had escaped Rome's grasp. The wind swept across the desert that day, carrying with it a haunting silence, a silence that has lasted far longer than the sound of any Roman trumpet. In the days that followed, the Romans secured Masada, but the atmosphere was far from triumphant. Soldiers wandered among the silent stone chambers, unnerved by the eerie emptiness. Instead of prisoners, laughter, or cries of surrender, they found only lifeless bodies and untouched supplies. The towering storerooms brimmed with grain, oil, and dried fruit, a stark testament that starvation had not driven the rebels to this end. The message was clear. They had chosen freedom over chains. Flavius Suva, commander of the legion, inspected the scene with mixed emotions. On one hand, his orders were fulfilled, the last Jewish stronghold in the revolt was extinguished. On the other hand, the usual rewards of conquest looted glory, and captives were absent. His men had built an engineering marvel in the desert, only to win what felt like a hollow prize. Some Roman accounts suggest Silva honored the courage of his enemies, while others imply he was quietly frustrated. Historians still debate whether he reported the outcome as a glorious success or an awkward victory without spoils. For the few survivors who had hidden, the tale they told became legend. They spoke of Eleazar's final speech, of families choosing death over slavery, and of the strange calm that settled as the end drew near. Whether every word of their testimony was true, or whether some embellishment crept in, is impossible to know. Still, the story spread, passed down through generations, until Masada came to symbolize both resistance and tragedy. Meanwhile, across Judea, the destruction of Masada marked the true end of the Great Revolt. Jerusalem had already fallen, the temple lay in ruins, and now the last flicker of armed defiance had been extinguished. Roman rule was absolute, yet paradoxically, the defeat at Masada ignited something far larger than the Romans could have predicted: a cultural and spiritual survival that outlasted empires. Oddly enough, some Roman soldiers later carved graffiti into the rocks near the ramp, leaving their names as though signing a guest book at the edge of history. Archaeologists have uncovered traces of these inscriptions centuries later, a reminder that even victors felt the need to mark their presence in the desolation. It's as if they, too, knew they had witnessed something unusual, something that blurred the line between defeat and victory. For the Jewish people, Masada became a wound that never fully healed. Communities scattered across the empire carried the memory of the revolt with them, whispering tales of bravery and tragedy. Parents told their children of the fortress on the cliff, where people chose death rather than slavery. Over time, Masada was remembered less as a place of defeat and more as a symbol of resilience. Even centuries later, pilgrims and chroniclers visited the ruins, climbing the winding paths to gaze at the silent stones. Some saw it as a warning against rebellion, others as a beacon of dignity. The desert preserved the walls, the storerooms, even the ramp, as though history itself wanted the story to remain visible. One curious note: later medieval travelers sometimes mistook the site for a Roman fortress, not realizing its Jewish defenders had given it its legendary meaning. This confusion shows how memory can fade and resurface, reshaped by each generation that looks upon the ruins. As for Rome, Masada faded into the background of its long list of conquests. The empire marched on, expanding elsewhere, fighting new wars, and leaving Judea, a province under watchful eyes. But within the Jewish memory, Masada remained a pinnacle, a place where freedom had been lost, yet paradoxically, also preserved. The desert wind continued to blow across the plateau, carrying whispers of that night when torches flickered, voices faded, and silence fell. If stones could speak, Masada's walls would tell of courage, sorrow, and the heavy burden of choice. And maybe, just maybe, they'd add a joke about how the Romans built the biggest ramp in history only to find nobody left to conquer. The sun rose slowly over the Judean desert, painting the cliffs of Masada in soft shades of gold and rose. The Romans had already departed, their camp dismantled, their ramp left standing as a monument of futility. What remained was silence, silence so deep it seemed to seep into the very stones of the fortress. Birds wheeled overhead, the only sound in a place that had witnessed both defiance and despair. Generations later, travelers would climb the snake path to the top, tracing the footsteps of those who had once resisted the mightiest empire in the world. The ruins of walls, storerooms, and watchtowers still stood, defiant against time. Each visitor looked upon the remnants and imagined what those final hours must have been like. The speeches, the cries, the courage, the fear. Some saw it as a symbol of freedom, others as a warning against hopeless resistance. Historians still debate whether Eleazar's words were preserved faithfully or whether they were embroidered with legend by survivors and later chroniclers. Yet, beyond the arguments of scholars, the story endured. Masada became more than a fortress. It became an idea. For the Jewish people scattered across distant lands, it was a memory of strength in the face of defeat. For others, it was proof of human resilience, the stubborn will to choose one's own destiny even when every path leads to loss. Oddly, one small archaeological find stands out among the heavier themes: a single clay cooking pot left in one of the rooms, its lid still in place. Was it abandoned in the rush of that final night, or was it left intentionally, a silent message to whoever might find it? Perhaps it was simply dinner that nobody lived to finish. History is sometimes written not only in grand speeches, but also in half-cooked meals. As centuries passed, Masada's story transformed into legend. In modern times, it became a rallying cry for courage, a place where new generations stood and swore that Masada shall not fall again. The fortress, once a tomb, became a beacon of remembrance and identity. It reminded the world that even in defeat, dignity can endure, and even in tragedy, hope can be carried forward. And now, as we close this story tonight, imagine yourself standing atop that cliff. The desert spreads endlessly before you, its stillness broken only by the whisper of the wind. The ramp remains, but it leads to nothing but silence. The walls remain, but they hold no defenders. Yet, in that silence, there is also peace. So, let us slow down. The torches have burned out, the swords are laid down, the voices of the past grow fainter and fainter, fading into the desert wind. With every breath, the weight of history drifts away, leaving only calm. Picture the stars emerging one by one above the desert sky, steady and gentle, watching over the ruins as they have for thousands of years. You are safe now. The world has quieted, the story has ended, but its memory rests softly, like the desert night settling over Masada. Close your eyes and let the stillness wrap around you. Imagine the warm wind brushing your face, the soft sand beneath your feet, and the endless horizon stretching out before you. And with that image, let sleep come slowly, like a curtain drawing closed. The battles are over, the empire has passed, and what remains is the peace of the night. Good night.